is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you for joining us this week. This week brings us another interview with a friend of mine, and it's in person, which is really, really nice. I've been doing mostly Skype calls, but I'm doing an interview in person this week. It's my friend, Adriane. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine. Really excited to talk with you tonight. So glad you're here in person. Thanks for driving down. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
We'll start first with your deconversion. How did you get to atheism, free thought? What's your journey and where are you now?
Well, I grew up, basically, my mother was a gypsy, our family was. We moved all over the place, hopping from church to church. And I was homeschooled through that whole time. Fundamentalist, literal Bible, the whole 9 yards. Then my parents got divorced. And when I became a young adult, since I never dated before, I had a boyfriend, I married my first boyfriend within 6 months. So, during my marriage, I was, still held a lot of faith. I really got into that church. They do podcasts of Bethel Church in
Bethel,
Washington. It's very hippy-dippy, new agey, you don't really have to commit to anything. It's just a more spooky Joel Osteen, I would call it, but
self-help with little smatterings of Jesus.
little smatterings of the supernatural there. It was just, I felt like I had to keep diluting the Bible with these new churches that I would get into, and I was getting into a podcast, and I honestly don't know what it was. I remember going to college, and I was painfully ignorant. My education basically stopped when I was 14. Mm-hmm. And when I went to college, it was a lot of suffering, and I made a real idiot of myself because it became very apparent how ignorant I was.
Okay.
How deficient my education was. So that's where kind of the anger at the system that I was raised in started to pop up.
Okay.
And so when I asked my science teachers a question, they would answer it. There was no, because I would ask questions as a youth about my religion or our religion, and if you got a little too deep, they got frustrated at you. They didn't want to answer it, or it was a lack of faith, or, it was always your fault for asking too much. And then I fell into this world where questions were, encouraged. That's how you got better. And it took me a while where I just stopped listening to it, and I honestly don't know what it was. I started working as a detailer. So it's just kind of mindless work, and so you just listen to podcasts. Mm-hmm. And I was desperately trying to fill in the gaps of my education with podcasts. Mm-hmm. Stuff you should know, stuff you missed in history class. I was so ignorant about, the history of America, because I was taught the whole, George Washington was basically this angel, that came down to create America, The
Founding Fathers are sort of akin to the 12 Apostles.
Yes, and I found out more these were complicated human beings. It wasn't as black and white as I had been sold.
Yeah.
And I came across the Thinking Atheist, Seth Andrews.
Yeah.
And I cannot remember the podcast. I have no idea. Oh, that's why. He was on the podcast, Top 20 or something like that. Uh-huh. I thought, God, these are dangerous waters, but I was so frustrated.
Yeah.
I thought, let's just do it, because every other taboo I had crossed, there was no lightning in the sky, there wasn't, my hand shriveling off in a curse, And so I'm let's just do it. It was my last kind of I wonder what happens if I do this.
Yeah.
And it was all the questions I wanted to ask. It was information that I had no idea that existed. And I got to meet him at Reason Rally.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great. Sounds fantastic.
Yeah,
he's a big impetus behind me doing my podcast. So,
yeah, he was super sweet, and I told him, you saved me. I didn't know who Dawkins was. I didn't know who Hitchens was.
Yeah.
And I grew up kind of in the satanic panic, where it's a lot of isolation from the outside world. And so I was kind of baptized by fire into secularism.
Okay.
with a thinking atheist, and literally like 7 months later, it was a Reason rally.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Your story is very interesting to me because most of the people I've talked to on my podcast talk about their non-belief is a very gradual process. Some of them it took years and years and years, and with you, it seems like you got it like that in some respects.
Yeah, it was a relief because I'm a firstborn, so everything's my fault, And so when it came to very fundamentalist religion, that really feeds into that, and it was like this giant pressure. There isn't a giant mean daddy over me.
Yeah.
Looking at everything I'm doing, and it was pure freedom.
Yeah, I love that phrase, pure freedom, because that's how I felt too. I mean, my process was years and years and years of, I grew up non-religious. My parents were non-religious, and I went through a process of just sort of studying religions, particularly in high school. And dated a girl who was a Christian, so tried to get into Christianity, which for me was trying to get into Bob Dylan's gospel period. That was kind of my way of doing it. I thought, well, if I can get into Slow Train Coming, maybe I can make this work. And then I was really into Buddhism for a while because I'm a huge George Harrison fan. I was really into sitar music and Ravi Shankar, so I tried to get into Buddhism. And I remember, I think it was maybe in high school or freshman or sophomore year of college, I read or tried to read a book called Becoming Enlightened by the Dalai Lama. And it was just almost impenetrable to try to understand it. In terms, it was constant sort of circular arguments and what Daniel Dennett calls deepities. Things that sound profound but don't really mean anything or don't mean that much. So it was always like the key to happiness is enlightenment. The key to enlightenment is happiness. And I was like, I don't really think this is for me. And then I just sort of discovered atheism through a wiki page and I was a fan of a musician. It described him as being an atheist. I was like, well, what the hell is that? Click on it, read the page. I was like, okay, I think this might be what I am. And from there I got into, the Horsemen. I think I read Hitchens first, and then I read Harris and Dawkins and Dennett. And a book that was very important to me was Atheism, the Case Against God by George H. Smith, which is my all-time favorite one-volume book on atheism, period. Which is not to dismiss how much I love Hitch, but Smith's book's awesome. And so it was just a matter of just sort of really evaluating and go like, yeah. And I love the phrase you brought up about the idea of pure freedom, because I remember when I finally just let it all go and became an atheist, I was like, there was a certain level of freedom that I felt. A certain weight was gone, that I didn't have to fill into society's norms about things. And then the other part of it was a certain sense of, it was a mix of freedom and responsibility.
Yeah.
So it was responsibility to be better, to do better, to act better, for not just myself, but for others.
For me, there was those elements too. But we grew up with a very supernatural, my mom believed in like faith healing, and I did too for a while too. And it was very woo. I mean, to the point of just freaking crazy. And my mother, looking back on it now, she was probably bipolar. It runs in the family real bad. Like I have a couple on her side. She has a couple of siblings being treated for it. Yeah. But when you're in those manic stages and the depressive stages, it's either Holy Spirit, I saw a vision, or I'm being demonically depressed. And so it hides mental illness. And I carried a lot of my mother's guilt. It was like that old-fashioned Catholic guilt with supernatural powers mixed inside. It was awful. And then I was homeschooled and never publicly schooled, and so I was so isolated that, I thought that's how everything was. And when I had that moment of freedom, it was like, so when something bad happens to me, is it because I made a mistake? If I can make a decision and there's no weight behind it. I don't have to wait for Jesus to send down a burning bush or, whatever sign I would beg for. I was empowered by my decisions. I had this moment of like, I have so much power on this earth. Yeah. With me, with my body, it was just, I still marvel in it. I still don't know how I lived for so long in that cage.
I totally agree. The other thing that I always think about is just the fact of how kind of beautiful, and obviously we all have dark days and bad days, but just truly how beautiful life kind of is. That there's this moment in time where you are allowed to be, where you are in existence. And so it made me reevaluate everything. I would look at bridges and go, holy shit, we figured out how to do that. Or medicines, or beautiful tall buildings. I'll never forget the first time I ever went to Rockefeller Center, which is one of my favorite places in the whole wide world. And just seeing these beautiful, amazing Art Deco buildings and the Atlas sculptures there, which I absolutely adore. And just looking at all this, I said, look at this. This is a monument. It's a cathedral to achievement and human ingenuity and science and reason and freedom. And I was just, it was almost religious the way I felt about it. And that's how it changed everything. I mean, becoming an atheist rewired my brain.
Yeah. And for me too, is a rewiring that is still in progress. There's still these moments that I have, like, for example, somebody, who's the director who did Bowling for Columbine?
Oh, Michael Moore.
Michael Moore. Okay, so I was raised to, he's like the devil incarnate.
Yeah.
And someone said, oh, Michael Moore has a new movie coming out. And I was like, Michael Moore, I instantly had that gut instinct of, oh dear God. I'm like, wait a minute. I've never seen a Michael Moore movie. What am I feeling? What am I talking about? It was like this programming switch that was still really buried in there.
Yeah.
But like being an atheist now, it's like I have so much more hope because there's not this cloud of, are you close enough to God? Is it really your heart? Where is it? It was always on you. And it was like, it is on me now. Mm-hmm. Just me.
Yeah.
There's no eternal calculator or logbook that's just holding everything down. And when you get up there, oh man, your butt's on fire. And I have a lot more hope. I've made a lot bigger decisions. Mm-hmm. I bought a car. I've, like career-wise, I've done some pretty awesome things, schooling. Mm-hmm. I would never have done as a Christian. I've been still waiting around for a sign.
That's awesome. And your selfie game is on point on Instagram too, which is the other. No, I feel that exactly the same way. My life, it was amazing how much my life gained a purpose when I stopped trying to look for one outside of myself.
Yes.
And that was really the because I became an atheist my freshman year of college, and that was like the moment I realized, like, my life is mine, like this is my shot, I gotta do this. And I went from being a good student but a pretty lazy student and a pretty apathetic student. I was way more into doing my own thing when I was in high school, to becoming very interested in just wanting to read everything and to learn everything and to try to get a grip on the world. That was really important to me. And so I like the idea of life being in and of itself, and the idea of achievement and happiness and joy and connection with others that is all a part of this beautiful world and this universe that doesn't have to come from something else. And the other thing that's great is you don't have to waste your time anymore on the nonsensical bullshit. You can just focus on you. You can focus for me, it's focusing on my wife and my family, and for your family, of course, and focusing on friends and connections and hopefully, doing things that will inspire others to go their own way.
Yeah, that's basically my value now. It's just leave things a little better than it was before. You know, I mean, just, if that's all you got to give, just give it. There's nothing. So many people put pressure on themselves, and I see remnants in the culture of certain religious kind of, was that meant to be, or is the universe punishing me? And it's like, okay, you have to get away from that sentient being in the sky that's, holding you accountable for everything you do. Like, we have consequences. That's what holds us accountable. Either we hurt a loved one, or, we hit a pole, whatever. That's it. It's over. And I understand there may be a romantic idea about that when we think of evil people who've killed. Like, oh, they're going to burn in hell. I understand that desire, but really, sometimes they don't get punished. And that's a hard pill to swallow. But I can't just take that part and maybe everybody gets punished one day and just take the whole baby in bathwater back. Because when you deconvert, it is a slow thing. Because for a while I'm like, oh, well, he'll get his in the end. Like, maybe he won't. Mm-hmm. Maybe he won't. It's like daily still I deal with it, where it's just like, I have to get rid of this. I feel like Scientology, the little alien ghost is like on me.
The Thetans, yeah.
That's it.
There's a great quote by one of my heroes and the person who did my thesis on Robert Ingersoll. He said, there are no rewards, nor are there any punishments. There are only consequences.
Yes.
And so yes. I think that's kind of how the universe is. There's something sometimes painful and stressful to people about the idea that the universe doesn't care.
Yes.
That there's a sort of a cosmic indifference. The idea that there's no one out there to catch you when you fall and no one cares. That's hard, because I think for some people, unfortunately, because of the way we are, for some reason, whether it's social or biological or psychological, there are some people where religion is the only thing that gets them through the day. And that's sad. And I look forward to a world where that's not the case. But we're always constantly looking for agency where there isn't any.
Well, again, kind of that agency outside of themselves.
Absolutely.
Like you were saying about like purpose, and what it does is, if you're depressed or you're angry or you're not able to keep good bonds because of bitterness or anger or whatever, it allows you to kind of put that away and not deal with it, because this agency outside of you does it. And that's one of the reasons why they end up alone or depressed or frustrated and confused when nothing's going right. Mm-hmm. I gave so much to the church. I did this and the other. It's like, why didn't you take that money and get a degree? Like that would have produced a lot more for you. But they rather hope that God is some sort of slot machine in the sky. And if you just keep giving and you keep pulling that lever, suddenly you're going to get all sevens one day and all that reward will come down. Because those televangelists preach that stuff. They're living this high life. Like, just keep giving. I was faithful. Keep giving. It's like, no, you set up a business.
Yeah. It
wasn't just you woke up one day and there was a pile of money on your front door. You swindled people for 20 plus years. But they don't see it.
And the sad part is, often those people never face the consequences of that. Like, James Randi, this is probably almost 30 years ago now, exposed the televangelist Peter Popoff in these classic experiments he did that were shown on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where Peter Popoff was this faith healer who would hold these huge conventions in these big stadiums, and he would go up to people in the audience and go like, your name's Bertha, you live at 555 Baker Street, and you got arthritis in the hips, and I'm gonna bring you up on the stage, and the Lord Jesus gonna heal you tonight. And so he would do all this shit, and he would give them all of these details. Well, what Popoff didn't tell his audience was that he had an earpiece in, and his wife fed him all the information about these people, because they would fill out a little info card when they walked in the building. It's very similar to like John Edward or those sort of psychic guys where they ask you to bring in things, and then so it's there's cold reading, which psychics do, but then there's also hot reading is when you cheat, and that's what Popoff was doing. Well, Randi did an investigation of him at a stadium or whatever, and he found that he figured out what frequency his wife was on.
Oh no!
And so they recorded all of it. So they recorded his wife's feed into his ear. And she was saying things that were not just ridiculous, but downright offensive. I mean, she called one woman, an African-American woman who was in the audience, a big black N-word.
Wow.
And said, and said these horrible slurs. And then, and this woman, of course, has no idea that this woman just called her a horrible racial slur over the earpiece. And she's crying profusely because she thinks she's going to be healed. The saddest part about all of this is Randi tells this story to Penn and Teller that when he was done with that investigation, they went out back and they noticed that they were putting all of the money that they had raised that night into these limos, these huge suitcases. And Randi describes it as kaboom, kaboom, as they fall into the trunks. And they went through the trash later and they found that the $5 checks were in the trash.
Oh my God.
That they didn't even want to waste the time to write 50050 on the accounting sheet, that they just threw those out. That wasn't worth their time to even deal with the $5 checks.
Wow.
Now, of course, Randy exposed Popoff for the fraud and charlatan that he was, but Popoff is still around today. He's still on television.
Oh, really?
He's still on television. The big thing he does now is he does anointing oil.
Oh, yes.
So if you send you send like $30 or $50, they
Mm-hmm.
send you a little fucking cotton ball with butter on it or whatever.
Yes.
and that's the thing,
That's by Pine Sol.
Yeah, I mean, these guys, they're a dime a dozen, and it's this weird mix of commerce and Christianity that comes out of, actually it comes out of the late 19th century.
Yes.
And the prosperity gospel really takes off then. But I'm really glad you brought up the idea of sometimes that we often try to imbue the universe with an agency that doesn't have. And sometimes that can lead to really harmful things. Yes. And let's transition into the main discussion here, because I think that you brought up a really great question to me the other day about the idea of, what did you call it?
Benevolent child abuse.
Okay, so let's go into that, because I know that Seth Andrews on Thinking Atheist did like a 2-part episode about this.
He didn't call it that. It was medical neglect in the name of name of religion.
Yeah. So let's unpack that, because that's very interesting to me. So what do you define as benevolent child abuse, and what are some of the ways that it's really harmed people in the religious dimension?
Well,
of it.
Currently, there's in every state there is some sort of exemption for childhood neglect. If they, instead of taking a child to the hospital, they pray for them. If they practice the tenets of their faith, they can't get in trouble. There's actually like 5 states where there's a religious exemption for manslaughter and murder 1 for a child. You can't do this to adults. You can do this to a child. Your child. When I was homeschooled, there was a point where I wanted to become public schooled, and my mom was completely against it. And we kind of talked to a lawyer, and it became very clear I didn't have a lot of rights because she was religious. And if she went in front of a judge and said, this is what I believe, it was a hard thing to fight. Mm-hmm. In Texas, recently, this motorcycle shop had 4 children from like 14 to 4 or something like that, and they didn't know how to read or write. And because the parents believed that the rapture was coming and there was no point. And so CPS took them, but the Texas State Supreme Court, the higher court, gave them back. It was a religious right to do that. If that's what they believed, they could do that. And being homeschooled, our first part of our education was quite good. And my mother, she was, and she still is, died in the wool believer. And she loved us. She really did. But she failed us hard. And she was allowed to because of her faith. And even when it came to medical stuff, like none of my younger brothers are vaccinated. And this whole anti-vax movement, that foundation was built on these Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Scientists who got exemptions from the state about letting their kids die, pretty much, or refusing medical treatment. This anti-vax movement would not be possible if it wasn't for those people fighting for exemptions. Meningitis, simple, treatable stuff. These kids die at a horrible rate. Mm-hmm. And they aren't doing this out of callousness. They're not doing this, we have this view of child abuse, and we hear these really horrible stories, like a kid locked in a cage and the mom was a drunk. But what happens when a child is not educated, so they have no prospects, they can't do anything outside of what their parents want till the end of their days. They are denied medical treatment. What are they going to do? Call 911, flag down an ambulance? And even if they say, oh yes, I want a blood transfusion, an 8-year-old is not going to go against their parents. They're not going to know what to ask for. But if the child lives in a clean, happy home where there's no drug abuse and they're fed 3 times a day, everything else, it gets put completely under a different umbrella, And it continues. And it continues and continues. But if their neighbor does the exact same thing, but without praying about it, being secular about their child abuse, they go to jail. They get in trouble. Those kids get rescued. And there is a whole generation being lost right now. I honestly don't, because so many states have such loose rules when it comes to like homeschooling. There's a lot, they don't know they exist. There's now a new movement where you don't get a birth certificate because you become a slave to the state and you're God's. So these children are being born. Nobody knows they exist. They're not being educated. They're not healthy. I mean, some of them are healthy, but like there's a health problem or a measles outbreak, they just bury them. And we have this to contend with as the next generation. We keep thinking that reasoning and, we're dealing with like Trump supporters and everything else. Like, okay, it'll be better in 10 years. It may not. Not if these are going to be the new adults.
That's true. And one of the things I know that we talked about before is in the United States, the way that the First Amendment is pretty much defined is it's defined, at least in respect to religion, it's defined in two parts. You have the establishment part of it and the free exercise part of it. So when you break down, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law with respect to establishing a religion. That's the Establishment Clause, which for the first half of the 20th century was pretty much the standard in terms of case law. I mean, if you look at some of the landmark cases involving church-state separation, they did it on the grounds of the Establishment Clause. Cut to the second half of the 20th century, especially once you have the ascendance of modern American conservatism in the courts, you have an overemphasis on the Free Exercise Clause, and the free exercise thereof, which is the other half of it. This is what happens when judges and a political elite get a little too overzealous about how we define the free exercise. So I always use the standard that children, especially children that are under maybe the age of 16 or 18 especially, it's tough because there's a part of me that wants to have more freedom, but there's another part of me that understands the nature of that we live in a society where sometimes it's best to make collective actions. With regards to children, the standard practice is that they do not have fully reasonable faculties yet. They haven't fully developed yet as a thinking, reasoning, independent being. And because of that, we often will resort to having children either be like a ward of the state, be held by child protective services. But that's in the secular context. Because of the very broad way in which we define free exercise in this country, far broader than most of our industrial colleagues around the world, it leads to the kind of abuses that you were talking about. And it's not just limited to Christianity. I mean, I know, for example, I believe it's either Wisconsin or Minnesota, I think it's Wisconsin, that there is a very huge uptick in a sort of more fundamentalist strain of Islam that came in with some of the refugees, and which led to a measles outbreak. Yeah. Because these people were not vaccinated.
They refused to vaccinate.
And they refused to vaccinate.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
And so it's, measles, which by the year 2000 was virtually eradicated in the developed world. And virtually eradicated in the United States. It went the way of polio. We now see it where if you just have a very, very small sector of the population that does not get their vaccinations, it does not create the necessary conditions for herd immunity, and we lead to outbreaks. Now, people can say, well, there's only a couple hundred here that break out. There's only been a few deaths. But I'm thinking to myself, this could have all been avoided had we not defined the free exercise so broadly. Because I think adults have the right to free exercise. I don't know if children do. And it goes back to the idea of, being an independent, reasonable being. Does that mean that children don't have rights? No, actually, I think that precludes us to give them more protections.
Yeah.
So
the thing is also, like, if they are being raised by someone to, like, we have no far is too far. I mean, what got exposed in Scientology was a huge amount of child abuse. One of the reasons why the Catholic Church went so long with just moving priests around instead of getting rid of them was because they viewed it as a sin more than they did as a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't even view this as a sin. Now, I'm not saying, every child has to report kind of Hunger Games style, like, and then you'd have to do an I step.
Yeah.
But, like, there definitely needs to be some sort of, like, even if you homeschool, you have to come in or you don't get your income tax check. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
You won't get your deductions for your children if you don't have them proof that they've been tested educationally if you're homeschooling.
Yeah.
Something along those lines. It's not hard. But the problem is when those bills go on the table, a lot of these women don't work in those communities. And so they just show up at the courthouse loud and proud with big signs, and they could do it any time of the day. Because, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, whatever, no problem. And it gets squashed down because their voice is so loud, but it may not be realistic. They just are able to form a mass super quick. And politicians, any kind of signs of protest, and they tend to quiver. Well, back in the day, they were a little more sensitive to it. Now they've kind of are growing accustomed.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me is that we're having this sort of, it's this weird contrast going on in the country where we have some of the, we have more and more of these exemptions and religious freedom things and all this and that and the other. I mean, I worked at the Stay House when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was being heard in the General Assembly. And I mean, when you said, like, all these people just show up, like, yeah, they do. The jean skirts were out in full form that day.
No makeup and the big bangs.
Big ass bangs.
Like a horn.
And hair down to the ass. So you had those people, you had Friar Tuck. You literally had, like, the monks who look like Friar Tuck. You had the nuns. And you had, I think, some very Orthodox Hasidic Jews. I mean, it was literally like a rainbow coalition of radical religion. And, the thing that bothered me the most was this idea that we're going to move the concept of religious freedom away from the discussion between individual citizens and the state, which has always been the standard way of doing it, to corporations or organizations in the state, which is, I think, a whole other matter entirely. Because what the Hobby Lobby decision that the Supreme Court did a few years ago really opened up the door for organizations that aren't even for-profit companies like Hobby Lobby was, but homeschooling co-ops.
Yeah.
And for-profit schools and charter schools and parochial schools to basically insist. And my issue has always been, if you want to be batshit crazy, that's fine. But don't do it on my dime. And don't do it in the public square. Yeah. You want to be batshit and kill yourselves because you have crazy ass religious beliefs? Fine. Stay in the fucking compound you're on. Yeah. I have a huge problem with the idea that these people want to force their view on everybody else. Because there is a public sphere. And the public sphere is secular. Doesn't mean anti-religious, it means secular. And it means that if there's certain things you have to agree to be a part of civil society. And if you're not comfortable with them, then you don't get any money. And that's really the problem that I have, is this idea that we're going to keep giving public money to religious nonprofits and religious organizations, and then they're going to discriminate against people, the LGBT community, for practices of hiring. They're going to do the crazy stuff with medical issues. They're going to do the kind of horrible things with education. I'm fine. You guys can do all that crazy shit all you want, but I don't think the state should have to subsidize what you want to do.
What also astounds me is, like, they piss and moan about sex ed, because they're terrified of talking about it. It's abstinent-only education. If there's anything else introduced, they freak out. And some of these people don't even have kids in school. They're homeschooling them, and they want to dictate what's going on in the schools around them, even though their children don't participate.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of gall to be like, I need to put my presence, God's presence through me, into the school where my child doesn't even attend. And it's like, I was terrified of school, especially college, because it was like, we got reprogrammed by the government. I was sure there was a room somewhere where you got implanted with a microchip. It was, I was waiting for like the Marxist guy to come out and beat me, so like I had been, these institutions, they're like, oh, it's the government. You think the government is this giant, maleficent entity.
Mm-hmm.
Yet they're collecting Social Security and food stamps, and the kids are on the CHIP program, and it's like, and they're getting all kinds of deductions for their church, and like they have no problem with the government when it's giving them something. Yet when it gives other people things, they feel cheated.
Yeah, and that's really my big issue. One of the things recently that's been an issue of this has been that the Trump administration has called for the use of federal flood money to rebuild churches in the wake of the hurricanes, Harvey and the other one, Irma,
yeah.
Yeah, and then Maria was the one that sadly hit Puerto Rico recently. Well, they wanted to use public money for that, and which is complete horseshit. First off, certain states already have very strong provisions against public funding for private religious entities. In fact, the state of Missouri was one of them, which the Supreme Court ruled against this year. In the Missouri Constitution, it's even more explicit than the federal Constitution. In the Missouri Constitution, it says no public dollar should go towards the creation or the restoration of a church. Mm-hmm. Flat out says it. But there was a Supreme Court decision earlier this year called Trinity Lutheran, which this church in Missouri had claimed for, I think it was some program that allowed for their playground to be covered with playground top that's made out of old tires.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a federal program that schools could apply for, and the church, which had this school as a part of it, said, well, we want some of that money too. And the Missouri courts rightfully said, no, you're a church, you don't get it. Goes to they appeal to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's argument is basically, well, what about the kids? Which is essentially the argument that they make.
Suddenly it's about the kids. I'm sorry, but the principle of separation of church and state is a little more important than a couple scuffed knees. Yeah.
Knees heal. Once you take a chip out of the wall of the separation of church and state, it's very hard to put back. So the court's reasoning behind this was absolute bullshit. And again, this was religious people claiming religious liberty when in reality they were claiming religious privilege.
No, what they were claiming is religious persecution.
Oh, yeah.
They don't use the word liberty.
No.
They have no liberty. This is, the devil's nation.
Yeah.
So they're desperate to be on that cross. And anytime, I remember growing up, I knew it all. You're raised with this persecution complex where it's like everything's after you. Don't listen to them because they're not Christian like us. It was very tribal. Very, very tribal. And if anything was against the tribe, it was an attack.
Mm-hmm.
And that mentality never leaves up to their politics.
No. And there was a shift that happened in this country, particularly in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, where Christians who were a little overzealous and a bit more theocratic, because there are a vast majority of people in this country who are religious who are not like this.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. They're liberal, and if they're not liberal, they're certainly tolerant. They definitely believe in the separation of church and state. The discussion we're having is a very vocal and very politically and financially well-organized segment of religion in this country. But with the sort of cultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s, particularly in regards to women's rights and abortion and the emergence of the gay rights movement, the Christian right in this country sort of reasserted itself. I mentioned this on an earlier podcast this month with my friend Kelsey Gordon, where we talked about the idea that someone describing themselves as Christian 50, 60 years ago was pretty uncommon. Most people would say I'm a Catholic or I'm a Lutheran. Yeah. With the cultural revolutions of the 60s, that changed, and they had to sort of reassert themselves. which is where you really get people describing themselves while saying things like, well, as a Christian, blah, 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 blah. So being a Christian wasn't just a religious belief. It became an identity. And we've had a lot of discussions lately about identity politics.
Yes.
And how sometimes that can be a little too pervasive on the left. I would say it's just as pervasive on the right.
Oh, yes. Redneck.
Yeah,
deplorable.
redneck. Exactly.
Yeah.
The sort of white Christian Protestantism, that kind
Wasp
of thing.
Wasp with attitude.
Yep, wasp with an attitude. I mean, shit, the wasps at this point are a little too elitist for the Trump crowd. But I think that's really the shift, and they became very politically motivated. And the vast majority of this country didn't know what hit them. They just didn't, because we were a country of secularism for the most part, and that was established through most of the 20th century, and that started to get slowly eroded.
Well, also was a giant uptake in the televangelist.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, they weren't like particularly Pentecostal or Baptist. They learned to whitewash their kind of brand so it could gather in more and more followers. And also with YouTube and the internet, we experienced this giant change with the internet just being everywhere, and we were taught how to access it and how to surf it and how to use it, but we weren't taught to manage the info. And so we have these crazy flat earth, Illuminati, there's already conspiracy theories out about the Vegas shooter. And videos like it had to be 3 shooters or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like, and also when it comes to the child abuse aspect, a lot of these people, like back in the day when I was homeschooling, like I'm 33, so date myself there a little bit. You looked for your curriculum in a magazine, and then you picked out what you wanted, and it got ordered. Okay, you didn't get really reviews, you didn't see what was in it, whatever. Well, now with the internet, online homeschooling is more prevalent, and online fundamentalist communities are more prevalent. They shut down a convention called Get 'Em Married, and it was supposed to be like 15 to 14-year-old girls and to meet these other families, these boys from the other families, because they're so homeschooled and isolated. They want to make sure that their ideas are the same. Well, we always think of cults as like, somewhere in one compound. But they're not with the internet anymore. They're all over the place. And they are mentally and fundamentally all in one place and believe one thing. And it really makes it hard for these kids to escape, because they can't even go into their own community to search for a friend or a partner or anything like that. They're now like basically shipping them to these conventions. That's for arranged marriage.
That's so interesting, and that's something that goes along with a bigger trend that we've seen over the last 50 years, and particularly over the last 20 and 30 of. And I know Seth Andrews actually did another great presentation about this. It might be my all-time favorite presentation he's ever done, which is one called The Copycats.
Yes.
It's the one that really got me into him because. Okay, so I'm a huge heavy metal guy. I love heavy metal music. I'm a huge fan of like Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Black Sabbath and shit. And I loved his presentation about, if you liked Motley Crue, you might like Stryper.
Yeah, exactly.
The Yellow and Black Attack.
The W's when, what was that guy, the Brian Seltzer Orchestra was popular.
Yeah. If you liked Cyndi Lauper, you might like, this guy. If you like Paul McCartney, you might like Phil Keaggy or something. And he makes a point of how Christianity in this country, particularly very fundamentalist or conservative strains, instead of placating to the culture, they created a culture around them to isolate themselves culturally. And so this is how you have...
Do not be of this world, the other world.
Be of the other world. And you also have just like this, and now it's a multi-million-dollar industry. I mean, the biggest thing lately has been the Christian films, which has been a whole other dynamic. And I know that the guys over at God Awful Movies can probably speak a little bit better to that than me. But this idea of, the worldly culture is bad, so we're going to create this whole other culture. Again, it's another form of isolation, and I'm not surprised that the internet has become another way of doing that.
I really think there's an idea, basic root of their thing is lack of contamination builds character. They feel like if they keep it pure, the purity is such, like, that's on everything when it comes to sexual purity, when it comes to the purity of your heart. I mean, that is their number one, thing they fixate on. And if they keep them pure in the culture that they deem is holy or God-given or has his blessing upon it, they're going to grow up into these really powerful people. And usually, I mean, like, the pastor's kids usually have the best drugs. I mean, it never works out. They go, as soon as they have a small taste of freedom, because they've never practiced decision-making. Because decision-making is a practice. And then suddenly they're 18 with a full-grown body, possibly a car, and cash from their new job. And they've never so much decided what kind of underwear they get to buy. And they go crazy, and they're like, I don't understand what happened. We raised him to be a good Christian boy, and now he's, knocked up half the neighborhood.
But that's the problem, right?
Yeah.
Think about it in this regard. I mean, I'm going to speak from experience, but, I grew up non-religious. I didn't have religious parents, and I didn't really have a religious upbringing. I have a job. I am married. I don't have children that I know of. No, just kidding.
Tomcat allowed?
Tomcat. I don't have any kids. I don't smoke. Basically don't drink. Don't do drugs.
And you're a real thrill.
Yeah. I'm a real thrill. My wife doesn't really drink. She doesn't smoke. And, I pay my taxes. I pay my bills on time. I've never had a late fee on a credit card bill. I mean, I think what's interesting is that I think that us as atheists, we often make, I'm not going to say this in general because I know there's some real shit people out there. I'm talking about you, Sargon. I'll have to edit that out. But fuck you, Carl. Anyway, his name's fucking Carl. Like, I love how he like has like, this badass YouTube name. His name's fucking Carl. Anyway, to learn more, listen to my episode with Karen Garst. Anyway, where was I going with this? Oh, yeah.
Taxes.
So, like, because we're atheists, I think because we realize how, like, incredibly important, like, personal responsibility is, like, we take it upon ourselves to, like, learn shit. And, like, okay, how does one have a credit card? How does one make sure they pay their bills on time? How do you rent a place? How do you buy a car? How do you do this? How do you do that? Like, you have to do it yourself because you can't rely on God to do it. And so these kids who've been raised in this very isolated social system where all they know is Jesus, and then they get out into the fucking real world and they're crazy. Yeah. Now that's not everybody, because I know there are a lot of good people who a lot of people who are religious or good folks who teach their kids some shit.
Yeah.
But
we're talking about like fundamentalist.
Oh yeah, we're talking about the craziest of the crazy. Yeah. We're not talking about most mainline Protestants here.
And what it's like, okay, well it's just a small sect, or we're not all that way. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If there's 1 million of you and only 1% practice this, that's still a lot of children because they breed like rabbits. Yeah. I mean, like having 5 kids is nothing, because if a woman's place is in her home, it's a little awkward for her to be home and not have any children to take care of. Yeah. What else is she going to do?
Plus, in many religions, that's the main thing that they think women are for. So that's how religion has survived. Religion has not survived because of men. Religion has survived because of women. And I didn't mean for that to sound sexist. I'm sorry.
Because I was listening to a podcast about how white supremacy has been sustained because of the women at home.
Yeah. And that's my point. Yeah. Which is that in this country, and I think I had a discussion, I think I mentioned this with Kelsey too, that one thing, and I know correlation doesn't always equal causation, but one trend that I find is interesting is as more women, particularly independent women, enter the workforce, religious rates in this country have declined.
Yes.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that women are the primary mode of cultural transmission of the children. And so if you're not a single mom, if you are a mother and you're in a sort of a fundamentalist Christian culture, chances are you're going to be at the church 2 or 3 days a week. Chances are you're going to be making the casserole for the potluck. Chances are your kids are going to be going to Sunday school every week. Like that's built into it. But if you're an independent woman and you got a job and you're raising your kids, and you don't have fucking time to do that.
No.
And so the religiosity declines. I think it's I'd like to see more research on it, because I don't know if that's definitive yet. It's more of a hypothesis, but it's something that I'd like to see more studies on, because I do think it's a trend that's interesting. And I think as more women in this country become more and more independent, because women are already on track to being way more educated than men in this country in general, in terms of college graduates, graduate school graduates, PhDs. Like, it's wild. And we're already having this emerging social problem of men aged 18 to 25 who have little to no education and are unemployed.
Yeah.
And that's becoming an emerging social problem. Anyway.
Well, when it comes to women and independence, and back in the old term, being the heart of the home, one of my things that I'm most proud of, I had a hard time. There was a lot of self-loathing when I was a Christian, because I had violated the laws of the land, basically, with, premarital sex or getting divorced or whatever. But with my children, I broke the cycle. If I have anything after everything I've accomplished, they won't live in that emotional fear. They won't be undereducated. They're practicing decision making now. They don't fear me because I have to keep authority, or else I have failed as a parent. I don't control my children. I guide them. It is my job to raise two healthy, functioning human beings. And when I got introduced to the world and I suddenly was, a single mother right as the economy was crashing, I had no skills. I was basically raised to be a good wife. And so I'm trying to support myself, and I can't. And I was so desperate. And I think that's another thing, too. Since the 18 to 25, low employment, low education, we get with these men, and then we end up abandoned very quickly. And so these single moms are basically what's changing the culture, because you learn real quick, I have to be better if this is going to work. I don't have skills, or, I know a girl, ended up single mom, she did her clinicals, and she basically squat down, gave birth, was back at school the next day and working. That is typical of single mother culture. It's I will not let my children grow up where they won't be able to take care of themselves, like what happened to me. Because I think we're on the tail end, and my generation was the tail end of, it was funny, me and Artie were watching a movie we were watching Outbreak from the 90s, and she's seeing all the doctors and everything else. She's like, where are all the women? I'm like, she has been watching movies in her young life where women are everywhere in the films, because we've pushed that, like the female Ghostbusters and everything else. Yeah. And I didn't grow up in that. So there's still kind of like this old school way I do relationships, where it's kind of like, would you like a sandwich? I'm not being subservient per se. It's just that's how you operate. Well, Artemis, my daughter, she's seeing the world in a completely different light. Yeah. She knows how important it is to be independent, because that's what I show her. Not to be good for someone. Be good to yourself first. I broke the cycle. I have an 11-year-old little brother. He just learned how to read. He can't do any math. He's being homeschooled, quote unquote, and they weren't able to do it. And there's really nothing I can do. Even if I say, hey, I want custody of him, we live in Texas. The religion is law of the land. And if she says that, my mother honestly believes that God will anoint you with the knowledge that you need when you need it. And her kids are very smart. We were all smart. But we had no tools to use it. We had no ability to, our study practices were shit. We had no structure. Mm-hmm. And then we were so afraid of the world outside in college, being this giant government entity, that we just flailed as soon as we hit adulthood. And with my kids, I know they won't do that. And that's been my biggest achievement. That's what atheism gave me. It gave me gave my children a future more than anything else. Because I already made a lot of my decisions, the major life impacting ones. But they won't make life decisions under that veil of, whoa, God gave me a sign, or this is what they want, or, they'll be able to make it for whatever damn reason they want to. And that's been I think that's what atheism has been the greatest gift, was for Artemis and Lysander.
That's beautiful. You almost made your host cry. Give it time. But I could not agree with you more. As a white man, I acknowledge at some level a certain level of privilege that I have in society. I never faced the kind of hardships or the kind of issues that you did. And I was fortunate to grow up in an environment where my parents championed learning, they championed asking questions, they championed being yourself. So did my grandmother. My grandma was a big part of my life, and she still is, and she also helped raise me. She was like a mom to me. And she always told me, Justin, just be yourself. Just be yourself. And that was so helpful. And even today, I'm this sort of radical atheist. I do a podcast. I've done this and that and the other. And my grandmother, who's 83 years old, or 82 years old, she'll be 83 next year. She just says, I love you and I'm so proud of you.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She's amazing. She was an amazing woman to me. When my mom and dad divorced when I was 14, my dad and I moved in with my grandmother.
Okay.
And we moved up north to around in Peru. Okay. And because my dad wanted me to have a new environment, have a more stable home life. Because my home life growing up, while some of it was good, I had a very unstable home life. Mm-hmm. My parents didn't get along. They often fought. My sister and I didn't get along. And I had a childhood that wasn't bad and certainly wasn't near what you had to deal with. But I did have a lot of loneliness and a lot of just not feeling like a fit in or whatever. But anyway, my grandma helped raise me. And my grandma's kind of a Unitarian Christian. Very, very, very liberal Christian. Her, and I come from sort of a background of that, where like my grandma's a very, very liberal Unitarian, non-church attending Christian. My dad is basically an agnostic, and then I'm an atheist. So I come from a tradition of people who sort of thought for themselves. But my grandma was the kind of person growing up where, when I was my little, shit-kicking punk rocker, and I had this trench coat I used to wear to school, which God. They couldn't let you wear now.
I was just saying, wow.
But I had this gray trench coat I used to wear to school as my winter coat, and I used to put patches all on the back of it and everything. My grandma would help me sew them on, and she'd teach me how to sew them on, or she'd help me glue them on with the fabric glue and stuff, and she was always so encouraging and so helpful, and I was blessed to have that. And so the reason that I do what I do now, whether it's, being a historian as my profession and getting a master's and writing my atheism in that regard, where I've had Robert Ingersoll, doing this podcast, talking with others, is that I want to be as vocal and out with my atheism as I can, because I know there are a lot of people who can't.
Yeah.
And because I'm like you, it's weird. Me losing religion gave me more purpose than anything could have possibly given me. And I have such a desire and zest for life that I didn't have when I was a kid, when I was just sort of a nascent believer. And so because I came from an environment of, I think, in my opinion, a lot of privilege, I think it behooves me to be a better person and to do all of the kind of things that I do. And kudos to you. I think your story is amazing. And I am awed because what I think you have done is so amazing. It is the pinnacle of what being a humanist is, and being a good person and trying to do good by your kids. And that gives me so much hope. And because I do think that people are basically good.
Yes, I believe that.
I think people are basically good. We're often poorly represented from time to time. But I think people are basically good. And I think what perverts people are ideologies that are totalizing, that tell you everything you need to know when you need to know it. Any philosophy or way of life that is that totalitarian is anathema to human flourishing. And so
I always say this because, like, especially with my GOP friends, like, they're selling black and white in a gray world. Mm-hmm. They're saying that they have the power to separate, the real from the bullshit and everything else. And what they're doing is blinding you, because that's not how it is. Yeah. But it's so easy to be like, right, wrong. Because if it's gray, you can't be right. Yeah. And they can't be wrong. You don't have that line.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the thing about the issue that I'm seeing in our political discourse is that we have one side who openly has contempt for the other, which is, I think, a huge problem. They don't just disagree with them, but they have contempt for each other. And what I'm worried about with both sort of mainstream liberalism and then mainstream conservatism is that the fringes are setting the tone for everybody else. So,
kind of like what I've been talking about, the fundamentals.
Absolutely.
Like, it wasn't normal Unitarian Christians getting these religious exemptions for manslaughter.
Yeah. It wasn't the Episcopalians calling this kind of stuff. Yeah. No, you're right. And I'm very worried about this idea that these sort of radical, hardcore leftists and then now you have the alt-right are setting the tone for how the conversation goes. And one thing that I've really advocated for in my podcast is sort of a new center where we have a discussion. And for me, that means I'm sort of center left, and I've always sort of been on the left and will be on the left, but I'm center left. And a new center of politics where we can have open and vibrant discussions about the role of government and the nature of freedom and the nature of democracy and what's the best way to live life and what's the best, should we have single payer healthcare? Could we have a market system? Would a market system work? Like, having those sort of complex conversations that don't just fall into the troll comment section where one person's calling somebody a troll or, a fascist, and another person's calling somebody a cuck. So it's like, how do we make our discourse more, how do we disagree in a more agreeable way?
Well, okay, this is where I'm probably a little bit more left than you.
That's all right. That's all right.
Just a scotch.
That's right. That's why I have a multiplicity of people on my podcast. Please.
Well, I guess, like, I was Republican. Like, I voted for Bush twice. Okay, that was my great shame. It's out there on the podcast. I am so sorry, Obama.
You are forgiven, my child. It's all right.
And so I was a devout Republican until I became a single mother. And the conversations during the Bush years, you could have talked about policy and stuff like that. Yeah. There was actual facts and numbers on the table. When NASA has to release a press statement that they don't have child sex slaves on Mars because Alex Jones did that story, I mean, it's beyond. There's nothing there. Those Republicans are either have left the game because they're so frustrated. Yeah. And it's like, okay, I made the colossal mistake of engaging my alt-right, cousin on Facebook. And it was just like, well, you can't, so an inanimate object is like, don't do that inanimate object bullshit. There's a reason why we can't get Oxycontin from bubblegum machines, okay? We have technology, we're supposed to manage it. Yeah. But these have no policy, there's no numbers, there's no data. And, Mitch McConnell, I think, is huge in those Tea Party Republicans of just, we're not doing this because of XYZ. Just, we're not doing it. No. No, and that's become the total right side.
No, and I completely agree with you. I can't think of a single individual who has done more harm over the last decade to our political life than Mitch McConnell.
I know. I mean,
I can't think of anybody who is that truly awful. The moment it moved into a realm that was disgusting beyond all recognition. I mean, there was obviously like the whole, we're going to try to make Obama one-term president, whatever. We're going to try to fight Obamacare or whatever. But the moment where I realized just truly how much of a cynical prick he was when Scalia died. Yes. Because, when they would make the argument of, we don't do Supreme Court appointments during election year. Bullshit. Yeah. Lincoln did it. FDR did it.
Violated.
He violated the Constitution.
Yeah.
You know, they completely and utterly violated the Constitution. And so, I talked about this with a friend about Justice Gorsuch, was my problem with Justice Gorsuch, besides the politics, because we can have a whole substantive discussion about that, because I definitely disagree with him on a lot of things, particularly the only thing he's really like stuck his neck out about in terms of church state issues is his view of public displays of religious
the
stuff.
commandments and stuff. Yeah,
he's been very vocal about that, and he's very wrong. But and I do not agree with his position on physician-assisted suicide. I mean, he wrote a whole book against it, and I firmly am against that, which gives you some insight into how he might view abortion issues. Again, that's a discussion we can have, right? My problem with Gorsuch being on that court is that seat belongs to Merrick Garland.
It does.
That seat belongs to Merrick Garland, who was nominated by President Obama. And what you did was so cynical and so nihilistic and so undemocratic because, we have to wait for election or whatever. Last I checked, we had a president. And not only did we have a president, but we had one who was elected twice, and one who actually won the popular vote both times. Yeah. You know?
It made a mockery of the court.
I think so.
I think the way reporting from the Supreme Court seems different. It's not so it was so sensational before when the Supreme Court it's got this against it. Now they're seeing this quiet tone. I was listening to the Daily New York Times podcast. Yeah. It's 7 minutes long. Great podcast, by the way.
Awesome. Yeah. I'll check it out.
And but they do kind of these smaller stories, and they talk about the Supreme Court, and there's just this brokenheartedness about it,
and it's cynical. Everything about it is cynical and maneuvering and bullshit. For example, the attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Now look, I voted for Obama twice. I worked on his 2008 campaign. I'm a registered Democrat. I'm a Democrat. I'm a liberal. I'm probably more to the center these days than I was, partly just because of just this whole last year or so has made me reevaluate everything. But there's certain things that I think were important. I think the Affordable Care Act was a definite step in the right direction. And not just the expansion of Medicaid, not just the expansion of the subsidies for purchasing health insurance in the marketplace, but the idea of the essential health benefits. Because I have a pre-existing condition. I have a thyroid disorder. My thyroid doesn't work. It's a pre-existing condition. If I try to get insurance before Obamacare, it was going to be much harder for me.
Obamacare saved my life.
Yeah. It
was the only insurance I had that didn't discriminate against me because I was a woman.
Exactly. And the fact that being a woman who's had children is a pre-existing condition, which is fucked up in and of itself. But I understood some of the more conservative policymakers, like one guy who I like to listen to a lot, don't always agree with him, but I think he's a smart dude, is a guy named Avik Roy, who I think he's a healthcare policy wonk guy. He worked for Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012. He had a very interesting and I think substantive conversation with Ezra Klein.
Yes, I listened to that one. Yeah,
on Ezra Klein's show.
Yeah, I love that podcast.
And Avik Roy is making the market-oriented case for free market healthcare, and making it well.
Yeah,
and making good points.
I can get behind that.
Yeah, exactly.
Where are you in all this chaos?
Exactly.
And when what was his name? The Ohio governor,
John Kasich.
He was taking this speech the other day on I can't remember. It might have been the Daily Show. Where the hell were you during the campaign?
Well, and the sad part about it was that his message seems very appealing now, but the problem was with the frothing sort of red hot nature of that Republican primary. The only person who was going to break through was somebody like Trump. And the thing about it is in terms of his support, it's pretty much stayed exactly where it's been. It's in the mid. It's either mid to high 30s and mid to low 30s, and that's been consistent. But we can have long-form substantive discussions about free market reforms to healthcare. There's certain things we could do, whether it's, maybe expanding markets outside of borders and things like that. We can talk about the expansion of tax credits for health savings accounts. We can do different conversations about that. I have no problem with that. What I had a problem with was the idea of Republicans pushing a Obamacare repeal, which wasn't a fucking repeal, by the way. The basic structure of Obamacare would still be there. What it does is it rolls back the Medicaid expansion, cuts off the entitlement by 2027, and then basically pulls the funding out of the market in order to do tax cuts. Like so the structure of the Affordable Care Act would be there. So even if they did all of that, let's say they did all of that horrible shit, and then they went to the constituents and said, we repealed Obamacare. No, you didn't.
No.
You're a fucking liar. What you did was you defunded Obamacare, and you basically peeled back some of its regulations. That's not repealing the Affordable Care Act. Because in order to repeal the Affordable Care Act, they'd have to have a filibuster-proof vote in the Senate, which is 60 votes, to do budget reconciliation, because that was what these health bills were. They were budget bills parading themselves around as healthcare bills.
Yes.
They can get to 51 votes. That's shady fucking movement.
Yeah.
And they always bitched about the Democrats saying, oh, you made this a closed-door process. Bullshit.
Yeah.
They worked for over a year and a half to get the Affordable Care Act passed.
And what pisses me off is, like, okay, like, my father is very Trump supporter, alt-right.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you know, they just passed it. You were there! You watched the news, you knew it took over a year. It wasn't like 30 years ago, it was like 12. Come on, man.
Yeah.
You know, like, they get so involved in these worlds that, like, it's like they'll believe something that they witnessed to be otherwise. And
yeah,
the Republicans, you know, have this knack of selling playing folks propaganda.
Yeah.
You know, like, I honestly think a lot of Republican voters think, like, they're out there, like, hustling cattle or something, you know, like in their commercials. It's like, they live a life of opulence you'll never understand. A health care that you have to pay for, you know, through them. And they're going to screw you over.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that the thing about this past election, and I've mentioned this many, many times with other people, is that this election was about culture.
Yes.
It had nothing to do with economics.
Yes.
Because Hillary Clinton made multiple arguments about, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, with middle class and things like that. She made those arguments. So did Bernie. But the thing is, the white working class abandoned the Democratic Party. And the reason they did was because the cultural shift that happened within the Democratic Party within the 1960s. You know, when Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1964, he said, I lost the South for a generation.
Yes.
Oh, how wrong he was. We've lost it now for probably 3.
Yeah.
And the Democrats, and this is where I'm going to rag on the Democrats because they're my team, but in some respects, never underestimate the capacity for the Democrats to fuck up an election.
No shit. No shit. Or like, you find a political opportunity. Like, if you just do this, you can get like 5 nominees in, and this, that, and the other. Like, nah.
Well, and the thing is, part of it is multiple things. One, despite her many benefits, Hillary was a very flawed candidate. No. I supported Bernie in the primary. I thought Bernie was a better candidate. I didn't think he was perfect either, but... And
I understood the cultural hate of the Clintons.
Oh, I get that.
Yeah, I mean, like, it has been since 91, just a propaganda thing against them.
Hitchens wrote a whole book about the problems with Bill Clinton. And my biggest problem with the Clintons, and I will still say this, is that they pretend to be all things to all people while simultaneously believing in nothing. Yeah. The problem, so, like, Donald Trump is a shameless fucking opportunist. Yeah. And so is Clinton. But the difference between the two is that Trump tells you that's what he is. And again, I don't want you to think this is me defending Trump, because fuck Trump. My point is that, like, he basically made the argument of, I'm a bullshit artist and I'm going to fucking tell you that outright. You know? And I don't give a fuck if I'm lying, because I'm just going to say what the fuck I want to. The problem that Clinton had was she was doing a lot of the same political tactics that everybody used, but tried to have this veneer of, oh, well, I'm not really doing it. And people didn't buy it. Just people didn't buy it. And there was fatigue. And that was, you know, it's very rough for a president to win a third term, essentially. Yeah. You know, it's happened very little in our country's history. It's really only happened twice. Mm-hmm. Martin Van Buren, who took over Andrew Jackson, and George H.W. Bush, who took over for Reagan. That's about it. Otherwise, it doesn't really happen. Yeah. So she had an uphill climb anyway. It just didn't help that I think she ran a crappy campaign. Like, for example, look at the states that were the battleground states that Trump won, like Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, you know, Pennsylvania. There's no fucking business for that dumbass to have won those states. But yet the Clinton campaign was campaigning in Georgia and Arizona for some fucked up reason. Why the hell were you wasting time? Were you so deluded as to think you were going to win?
Yeah.
Because if she couldn't beat Donald Trump, she couldn't beat any of them. And that's the real tragedy of it. And the Democrats have to start giving a shit about local elections again.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's just...
And what I found really frustrating about, like, the Democratic thing is, you know, at first, when Trump first won, I was devastated. You know, my brother-in-law, he's a DACA recipient. Okay, he was born here as a child.
I talked about him on a previous podcast.
Yeah, and so, you know, like, I'm a woman, you know, and
I have a job for the National Endowment for the Humanities, so I was a little worried.
And, you know, my kids probably just lost their health care because they didn't renew the chip program. Mm-hmm. And so when it came to them, like, oh, we have to reach out to white voters, I'm like, fuck them. They're old and dying anyways, you know. I had this real callous attitude. I could not feel any compassion. It's like, what were you done to us without any sorrow? You don't even have the balls to look at this rationally. Yeah. You know, and I came to this place where it's like, there is white culture where, you know, granny and apple pie and Thanksgiving and stuff like that. And it was not valued. It was kind of put down, you know, for a couple of years. And despite its privilege, it's always had this hierarchy thing. Well, you know, kind of like, oh, we don't have jobs, and we're not as represented. Everything is like, oh, welcome to the club, homeboy. You know, you know, there was no sympathy. But it was, I see it now as culture shock. Now that we're on this even playing field, and maybe white work doesn't mean twice as much as black work, or, you know, as the work of a woman or something like that. Yeah. Then it's, you know, I had this kind of vengeance, like, haha, you know. But that's how that part of the country sustained itself. And now it's finding itself lost. And the Democrats have completely abandoned. It's like these programs that you want to give in Washington of, like, you know, national health care or whatever. Why don't you have teaching programs in, you know, Kentucky or Virginia? Get your name out there. Yeah. Get that little donkey everywhere. You know, it's like... they don't want to get their hands dirty. I agree. One of the biggest problems that I have is that the Democratic Party, I think for about a generation, has really hinged on the idea that we're going to win two specific voter blocks. And those are the ones, because the demographics are in our favor to win. One are white collar professionals. Mm-hmm. The people who work in Silicon Valley, people who work in offices, people like me. I don't know. Some of those guys have come out to be... Oh, I mean, Peter Thiel's a nutcase. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's some of conservatives in Silicon Valley. My broader point is that they were appealing to sort of white, upper middle class, white collar professionals and minorities. Mm-hmm. And that was it. And I think Clinton ran this election as if it was sort of like 2020 or 2024 or 2028. Yes. Where the demographics would have been there and it wouldn't have been a problem. But they're not there yet. And Trump and the Trump phenomenon, because it was a social movement, became the political one. And that's really the thing, was that he animated a section of the country that had been so, like as you said, derided for so long. And right or wrong, I mean, I think most of these people are fucking awful. Don't get me wrong. But you know, a lot of people who voted for Trump are not racists. A lot of them are not sexist. A lot of them are not horrible people. There's a lot of them that are. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. There are a lot of them that are. But a lot of them didn't. And there were a lot of people who voted for change. If you look at a lot of the counties in the battleground states, a lot of them that voted for Obama twice voted for Trump. Mm-hmm. So it was change over. And Clinton's problem, and it was a uphill climb, was that she was a continuity candidate in a change election. And there are really two things that I think need to happen. One, and this is something I know Mark Lilla has talked about, and he's a New York Magazine columnist, and he's written a really great book called The Once and Future Liberal, where we need to bring back an old-fashioned word, one that doesn't get a lot of love anymore, but something I think is important. And it's citizen. Yeah. We don't see ourselves as citizens anymore. We live as a culture that is hyper-individualistic. Yes. Now, I have
gone on in this podcast about the value of individualism. I think some individualism is good. But we live as a society, and we live in a democracy. A democracy is not a spectator sport. And one of the important things about living in a functioning democracy is the value of being a citizen. And realizing that you are a part of something bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
And
that's one thing I miss about France, because I lived in France when I was a teenager.
Oh, okay.
And there was this kind of, fraternity, meaning brotherhood.
Yeah.
That was part of their logo. It's like, you take care of your fellow citizen. If you're French, it's proud to be French.
Yeah.
America doesn't have that anymore.
And Lila's argument, it's one I agree with, is that both sides of the political spectrum have sort of fallen into this rabid individualism with more extreme strains of identity politics. And his whole argument is that political movements succeed when they have institutional power. You can have all of the protests you want, and you can do all of the writing campaigns you want to do. But the way you win is through institutional change. And if liberals want to win in the 21st century, they have to regain some of that institutional power. They can't have everything hinge on the Supreme Court. They can't have everything hinge on the presidency. The reason we've seen some of the horrible theocratic shit that we've seen in the States is because the Democrats dropped the fucking ball.
Yes.
On city councils, school boards, mayoral races, county councils, state houses, governorships.
Places where people can go.
And some of that's dark money in politics. Some of that's Citizens United, sure. Some of that is gerrymandering, don't get me wrong. But the Democrats should have fucking anticipated that. And they didn't, because they were so obsessed. And again, this goes back to, I think, the bias of Democrats sometimes is their obsession with the federal government. That they think the federal government is the only way you can enact change. And no, it's in the word federalism. It's separation of powers between the three branches of government at the federal level, and then you have federal, state, local. Those different divisions are where the power is held. This is how, since 2011, we've had some of the most draconian anti-abortion laws around this country. And
voter ID suppression.
Voter ID suppression. Anti-immigration. These religious freedom laws, all the things we've discussed earlier, because Democrats and liberals dropped the ball on this. And
I remember when Hillary announced that she was running that commercial, and all I thought was, you selfish bitch. Because she was poisoned. She was poisoned. She knew the cultural hate that was, they should have had Elizabeth Warren, or they should have, it was like, why did you do that? If you really care, you knew you were tainted, and you weren't going to be able to talk your way out of it. I voted for her because, I
did too.
She's a very intelligent woman. She's a strong woman. I don't believe, there's bodies in her basement.
Some of the crazy shit that they say about her is nonsense.
She did have an amazing career, she was.
She would have been a fine president.
She would have.
I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, I think she would have done an excellent job. I really do. But she was tainted in a way that there was no way, with still so many baby boomers and people who lived through the Monica Lewinsky and the Clinton and the Dick Lugar shooting guns, seeing if they could hear the gunshot bullshit. They still remember that and quote that shit. Yeah. You cannot run for president. No. You just can't. And I think being Secretary of State, she's like, well, I did this. Like, you were appointed. The people didn't vote you in.
No. That was a deal. I don't mean to get too conspiratorial here, but I'm going to say this, which I think is important. So when Obama beat her, one of the key reasons that he beat her was that he had more experience in foreign policy. That was the main reason that he beat her, among other things. Obviously, the momentum being the history-defining candidate was. Yeah. And he tapped into some of those unifying aspects that I talked about earlier. The Democratic Party needs to be more like Barack Obama and less like Hillary Clinton. That's my opinion on that. And so my thinking on it was, okay, so where is the one field of expertise that she's weak on? Foreign policy. What job does Obama give her in the White House? The top foreign policy job in the world. It's no surprise. I have a feeling that they probably had a handshake deal where it's like, I'm not going to get... It's not like he didn't win the primary. He clearly beat her. Well,
no, even Biden's wife said that. When there was he said that he came in, it's like, do you want Secretary of State or do you want Vice President? And he gave Biden the option. And he was like, I want to be Vice President. And so he gave Hillary And she's like, I know I'm not supposed to say this. She said something like that because I think the Oprah show was still on.
Yeah.
When I saw this. And no, but she said, like, he went to before, like, they were starting to run, like, if that happens, do you know, which one do you want?
Yeah.
And he's like, Vice President.
Which is a smart move. I mean, Biden, people like to kid with Biden. Biden was an incredibly important force in the Obama White House, especially within the first couple of years. A lot of the policy stuff was going on. A book over there on that shelf, I've got The Promise about Obama. Mm-hmm. It's called Obama Year One, but it's really the first year and a half. And Jonathan Alter, the author, makes a really great point that because of Biden's deep connections in Congress, I mean, he was the youngest senator ever elected, one of the longest serving senators in American history. He was instrumental in getting the Affordable Care Act passed. Yeah. He was the conduit because Obama didn't, as we well know, Obama didn't have the greatest relationship with Congress, even when the Democrats had it. So Biden was sort of the conduit between the two. He was incredibly important. I always thought that Hillary Clinton would have had much more power as Senate Majority Leader, which I always thought was a position she should have had, that she should have stayed in the Senate and become Majority Leader. But Secretary of State was a decent position. And I agree with you. I think she would have been a fine president. Her presidency would have been just like Obama's. It just would have had a more aggressive foreign policy.
Yeah, which I probably, which
I would have had problems with, but I could live with that. Because it's within the normal, within the normal realm of political possibility.
Foreign policy, not like nana boo boo to North Korea.
But Donald Trump represents the culmination of a deep strain of American politics, which has always relied upon spectacle and nonsense. There's a great article in The Atlantic, which is a portion of Kurt Anderson's new book. And I think the article was called How America Went Nuts, or How America Went Haywire. And he wrote this whole book about, the strain of America that's always leaned on bullshit, on mysticism, on superstition,
snake oil,
on magical thinking. And how there's a clear line between the sort of hippy-dippy attitude of the 60s. I'm like, well, this is my truth and your truth, man. Like how that, which became the bastion of the political left, today turns into, oh, well, that's fake news.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. The real problem that we have in our culture is a couple things. One is cultural relativism, the idea that all cultures are equally valid, which is not true. I think that some cultures are inherently better than others. I think the culture we have in the United States is better than some of the countries in the Middle East, where women are, sold off to husbands who are twice or thrice their age.
Well, that happened too.
Who are, absolutely. It does, but it happens in much less numbers, and it's an extreme, and it's an abhorrent practice here that we make a point of, but they are at standard practice. Mm-hmm. And, or if you are a homosexual, they throw you off a building.
Yeah, no.
Or if you are a woman, you leave your home unveiled, that they stone you to death. There are just certain cultures that, I'm sorry, they're objectively better in terms of human flourishing. The other problem is postmodernism. The idea that truth is nothing but a construction of power. That's also bullshit too. Say that to somebody, okay, let's say you're at the top of the building. Do you think it's a social construction that if you walk off, you're going to fall and die? Is it a social construction that 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen is water? No, that's a fact. And it's this denial of science. It's this denial of critical thinking.
I don't know how many times, because my family is extremely religious. Like, I have an uncle that's a pastor, and and he's like, what is truth? And this, that, and like, look, if you don't know what truth is, we can't do this conversation, because I'm not gonna ABC play this game with you about truth. Yeah. If you don't understand that, if you cause pain, well, what's pain? This, that, and the other. It's like, are you a sociopath? Like, did you not notice that it's pain? Or I remember, not with my uncle, but with somebody else, they were talking about when in the story of Lot, how the daughters were like, oh, all the men are gone, we got to get pregnant by daddy. Yeah. So they get him drunk. They're like, well, he was drunk. I'm like, well, how many drinks would it take for you? Before you slept with your daughter.
And that's besides the point. It doesn't matter how much alcohol you've had. The idea
it's just like this truth is just this wobbly thing that they just pick and choose from, and it's like when you say no, that's not true. It's like this is persecution. Like, no, your group has decided this But there's things outside of your group, that lack of citizenship.
Yeah.
Lack of seeing us as fellow Americans, because we're either liberal or we're different color or different religion or non-religious, has made it significantly worse. Where truth has no value.
It's up for grabs.
Yeah.
And it's funny because the religious fundamentalists who hate the radical leftists in the universities, they're so much more alike than they are different.
Oh yes.
And that's the thing that's so interesting is like the jerk off cultural Marxist at a university, hanging out reading, Derrida and Foucault is actually pretty damn similar to the religious fundamentalist.
Yeah.
It's a complete lack of understanding that there is an objective reality. There are objective facts. There are things for us to discern about the world. That truth is what's in accordance with the evidence. That, not everything is a relationship of fucking power. That some things are actually real and some things are not. And that's really the problem that I have. And it's this, that's why I hate that phrase of something like, well, my truth is my truth and your truth is your truth. No.
I can't pretend. This is who I am.
This is who I am. Or,
me.
This is what's true.
Well, you was a dick.
Yeah, exactly. Or this is what's true for me.
Yeah.
Well, fine. This is what's true for me. That phrase really means this is my opinion. And just say that. I try my best to say this is my opinion, this is what I think is fact. If my facts are wrong, I'm happy to correct myself. Mm-hmm. That's the nature of being a critical thinker and a skeptic.
Yeah, you have to embrace being wrong.
Yep.
There's no shame in that.
And you have to embrace the idea that there's the possibility of right and wrong. Because we live in a culture of relativism and postmodernism where there's almost no discernible value to what we think of as being truth. And this is a huge problem. This is what has made me really changed a lot over the last year or so on some of this stuff. I mean, I'm a liberal. I mean, I vote Democratic. I'm pretty solidly on the left, but there's some stuff about both extremes that I find absolutely abhorrent. And the sad part is they're taking over the narrative because the extreme tends to do that because they have the time, they got the money, and they got the passion for it. It's very hard to be sort of a political moderate or political centrist like I am and make that sexy. It's not terribly, it's not terribly sexy, And so, a political ideology or a political movement based on critical thinking, science, citizenship, objective facts, like that's what I'm interested in trying to build. And I hope that I can get people from all sides of the political spectrum involved, because I think if we can start having more conversations with one another, we won't hate each other so much, and then we can maybe come to some conclusions and some compromises and get some things done. Because the moment we just continually hate each other, that's really going to be the end of democracy. It's because it'll just descend into chaos. And that's what we've seen, whether it's Charlottesville or what the horrible events that have happened in Las Vegas, the shooting of Congressman Scalise earlier this year, that when conversation is no longer the means by which we deliberate how our democracy works, we descend into violence.
Yeah. And so I have a question. When are you going to run for office? Because democracy's not a science.
It is not a spectator sport. So my main role, where I situate myself in this, is as a public intellectual. My main goal is to have these conversations that can then, because this is what I'm good at. I've tried doing some of the sort of politicking and organizing and working for organizations, and I find that I'm not very good at it. What I am good at is having conversations with others who I either agree with, don't agree with, have and have diverse discussions that then inspire people, because that's what I'm very interested in. I'm very interested in giving talks and doing the podcast. I'm going to eventually do some more content on my YouTube, things like that. Being a content creator is the thing I think I'm most interested in, which is not to say that public service is a bad thing. I mean, one of the problems I think in our culture is that public service has gotten such a bad name, and that politics has become such a dirty thing to some people. And I'd like to hopefully get it to a place where it's a little more noble.
Well, I was saying to my friend the other day, I have a pretty cool coworker. He's extremely intelligent. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And we have these big conversations and stuff. And I was saying, I just wish I had the confidence of the stupid.
Right? That's another reason.
I miss, there's times where I miss, when I was a believer, just having so much confidence in my thoughts. And, oh, God, I miss being that right.
It's that quote. It's usually off, the aphorism is usually attributed to either Bertrand Russell or, oddly enough, Charles Bukowski, the idea that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt. And that's, and that's really, did I say that?
No, they're full of confidence. The intelligent are full of doubt.
The stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt. That's what I meant to say. Thank you. And I think that's true. Part of being, I think, an intelligent person, part of being, I think, a critical thinker, part of being a skeptic and somebody who likes ideas is that you understand that life is brimming with contradiction. That the world is very messy, and that, which leads people down the path of postmodernism and relativism, because it's so hard to sift out the nonsense from the reality. And we're not perfect at it, I wouldn't even claim to. But because we have so much of that sort of existential dread about not so much being wrong, but the consequences of being wrong, that we know the consequences of being wrong, I think, better than other people. And being shamed. That it makes it a lot harder for us to be so cocksure about it. It always reminds me of the opening sequence of the film Idiocracy, where you have like this.
The Great Prophecy, I call it.
That movie, the shit's becoming more of a documentary every day. I mean, I tell people all the time, and they don't get my reference. I'm like, we literally live under President Camacho.
Yeah.
Like we're going to get to the point where it's like, we're going to feed because it's got electrolytes. That's why we're putting it on the cross. That movie's so fucking good. Anyway, but the opening sequence where you have like this like very intelligent, very well-educated middle class couple who can't have a kid.
Love that
and these
sequence.
Like white trash motherfuckers who can shit out kids.
Yeah.
And it's like,
yes,
natural selection does not care.
No.
It's all about the progeny of the genes. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, my wife and I, both of us have college degrees. I have 2. We're very well educated, solidly middle class. We don't intend on having kids. And not because I think it's bad to have kids. I think it's wonderful. It's just not for us. And I could sit here and have a real lofty reason for it, but it's mostly selfish. I like my life the way it is. If I have a kid, I have less money for books. I have less time to do this. That's, but I think parenthood is an amazing thing and a wonderful thing. And I applaud people like yourself that do it, but it's not something I want or I don't want right now. And the thing is, there are so many people like me who get to that place and they're like, yeah, that's where we're at. Or like the average median age of parents in this country is also getting older too.
Mm-hmm, yes. As it should be.
As it should be, yeah. But then you have all these dumb motherfuckers shitting out kids and they don't have any fucking business. And I go, the Duggards, you got the fucking, like, you have all these like white trash sons of bitches who just fucking, like I said, just shit out kids. They got no business having kids. Fucking
As I say, like, you see the stickers with like the 15 little kids on the broken down van, because they can't afford much. Like, it's a vagina, not a clown car. Okay?
Oh, damn right.
Slow the hell down, lady.
Yeah, it's not a docking bay. Like, don't fucking.
Well, I'm gonna push back on you here for a second.
Please do.
Because I think it's important that people like you have children or even adopt. You don't have to don't do that to your poor wife. She doesn't want to say adopt. But you need a presence in our schools. Yeah. And when it comes to running for office, because I've talked to a couple other friends that we mutually know, but I'm not going to say their names, but that they're extremely intelligent and they have a lot of strong political education, but they won't run for any kind of office. And it's like, you have to take a physical space in this.
Yeah, I agree.
And the fact that you have no children or, something along those lines, just city councils, just something very, very, very small, or just get it, into those things. We are begging you. I talked to my other friends, please physically occupy that space, because these people who have nothing else to do, and they will get to there. They will have that space. And then all these problems that we're currently facing, especially the Trump era with the states and everything else, we don't have enough intellectuals in politics, and that's why it's turned so south. We don't have people on the city council, on the school board, because a lot of really educated people, I'm trying that again, aren't having children or introducing children, so they're not in the school. My kids are going to school with kids who are really, really rough. So
that's
it's
terrifying. I couldn't even imagine.
Find one that has a doctor as a daddy, please.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing too is this idea that it's and I'm guilty of this. I mean, part of why I went into the profession that I did was I knew I didn't want to really be a politician because I knew that wasn't my thing, and I knew I didn't want to be an activist because I enjoy being at home and bathing regularly. That my goal as a public intellectual is to inspire people to think of things in different ways and to create a discussion that will hopefully advance something. I mean, I have voted in every election. I've worked on political campaigns. I've donated to political campaigns. I've done all of that.
But your audience has to seek you, correct?
True. And in some respects, I think where I want to try to do more is involve myself more in the secular movement. So doing presentations, going out to secular organizations. I'm just made a contact with Jim Helton, who runs the Tri-State Freethinkers. He's also the national field organizer for American Atheists. Mm-hmm. And he's doing this very thing. And I'm helping him with that. Part of the other reason too, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but earlier this year I worked within an atheist organization. Mm-hmm. And it didn't go very well.
They're like churches.
Yeah, they're like churches.
They split.
There was a lot of office politics. I got caught between a leadership struggle. I was asked to do things I wasn't comfortable with, and I left. And that has really soured me on that kind of thing for now, which is why I'm doing this. But my hope is that in the future, maybe I'll come more out of my skin and do more of it, because I know it's necessary. I know that it's very easy to do what I'm doing here. It's a lot harder to do some other stuff, and that's a failing on my part that I do acknowledge.
Well, I guess I kind of see. I don't know if you remember that movie Ever After with Drew Barrymore.
Yeah.
Okay, well, do you remember the speeches they always gave the prince? Like, you're born to a place of privilege, and with that becomes a certain responsibility. And since you have spoken about your privilege of being, an educated male who doesn't have all the burden of old ideologies or something along those lines, it's like, if you're born into that privilege where you have access to the education and it didn't murder you financially, or that you can actually have a career that's in that field generally, that's kind of, education has become not so accessible anymore. And to everyday people are terrified of the sticker price. And a lot of online colleges really screwed over people. And so they're less and less inclined to sign up. And really where the money is at right now is trade schools. It's not in humanities. I'm getting an industrial maintenance degree. I would be basically a glorified grease monkey. And because that's where the money's at. But I would love to do political science or, something along those lines, but I can't.
Yeah. And I don't have much refutation. I think that what you've said is great because I am in humanities and I am a public historian. And so I acknowledge that to a certain extent, my ability to have a job is predicated on people like you having a job. So what I mean by that is that in this, the main thing that I produce, if you call me a producer, if you will, is I produce ideas. That's what I do. That's my stock and trade. Some people make widgets, the classic, this is the widget that Bob makes today, or cars or shit like that. My thing is ideas. And I acknowledge that my position is paid for through public money. And I take that very seriously because I know the importance of public money, because I know that's money that could go into a family's pocket. Mm-hmm. So I acknowledge very well that my position is based on that. And so I think it's great that we celebrate different ways of training. Like, one of the problems too is, like, you know, we've had this sort of culture, and I would want to see this change. I really do. That kind of shits on the idea of trade schools, and I don't like that, because, quite frankly, in terms of marginal utility, for as much as I love what I do, I would argue that a mechanic probably has more marginal utility in the economy than me.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm kind of expendable, whereas he's not. And I acknowledge that my position is based upon the wealth and the success of the society that I live in. So with that in mind, I do think it's important that we have a diverse economy that's based on different types of training, things like that. The other thing that we're going to have to reckon with in the future, and I know everybody's talked about it, but it is very important, is that chances are your job's not going to be taken by an immigrant. It's going to be taken by a robot.
Yeah.
And
immigrant from space.
You know, immigrant from space. You know, hey, here's the immigrant who took your job. It's the Mobro 4000.
Yeah. It's from Japan.
It's from Japan, exactly. It was built in Mexico, but designed in Japan, built in Mexico. And there's going to be huge sectors of this country that are going to be not just unemployed, but unemployable.
Oh, yes.
And so that gets in discussions, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but we can have a whole other discussion about universal basic income and things like that, which has become a real hot topic in poli-sci, and some people have different takes on it or whatever. But you know, I don't have a good answer for you about what I should do. I really don't. And
I'm not saying what you should do. I'm saying because I don't want to be like preaching like right.
No. I appreciate it. You've challenged me, and I think it's a good thing.
I think that because, especially with really intelligent people, you know, they can lionize the ideas or the bar.
Yeah.
The bar, and so like when it's like I'm not as educated as you are, you know, like you could do circles around me. But I know where the bar is. Yep. And I can push it. It's like I can read people to the point where it's like that's my thing was reading people. It's like these people who are extremely intelligent and have an amazing heart, and they're not going to be satisfied with just sitting home and talking about it to the TV. I don't see like you're being satiated with not being able to reach out. Yeah. You know, it's like I'm asking as a citizen to have that reach fill a public space, you know, because someone else keeps filling it and it's doing damage. You know, like I don't have comprehensive sex education in my children's school. When they were going to Eastern, they were still making them pray, you know, at the beginning of school and everything else. There was no, who would I run to? Who would I talk to? Hey, I'm an atheist and this, that, and the other. They just laughed me out. Yeah. You know, I knew I didn't have a voice. I knew I didn't have anybody representing me. Even if they were a Democrat per se, they're not going to stir that pot.
Yeah, and even if you had contacted the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Oh, God, and they found out who
had done it. I mean, you could have faced serious public ostracism for that. And which is part of why, you know, and I know David Silverman makes this point a lot, which is that we need to normalize atheism too. Yes. That atheists are your teachers. They're your nurses. You know, they're your mechanics. You know, they're your public servants. They're your civil servants, people like me who work in state government. That they're everywhere. And that we're not spooky. We don't eat babies on the weekend. We don't worship Satan. For yourself. Right? Delicious. We don't worship Satan, which is always funny to me because I don't worship the winner. Why would you think I would worship the loser?
Like what Nick Sorson says, like, he's talking about, nobody goes up there like, I'd like to thank the man downstairs.
Exactly. Nobody does that. It's like, I don't believe in God. Why would you think I believe in the devil? And, but I do think that, like, I think the overrunning conversation we've had tonight is one of the ways to combat theocracy, you know, because I think my title for this tonight is going to be The Danger of Theocracy, is the idea that we need to have informed citizens who can make better decisions to change the nature of citizenry. So,
and I think what people really need to know, because I get frustrated with like, oh, just let them believe what they believe and this, that, and the other. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I don't think you know there's an exemption to manslaughter. Yeah. It says, I don't think you know how far this gets. Like, Medicaid will pay for these prayer sessions for the Christian Scientist.
Mm-hmm.
Your tax dollars are going to some voodoo priest. Do you understand that?
Yeah. Or Medicaid money that went to gay to straight conversion therapy.
Yeah, exactly.
Where they would claim it as psychiatry or mental health therapy when in reality it was conversion therapy.
Yeah, it's like these children are being buried in mass. Do you not get it? You know,
Yep.
and that's being someone who wanted out and knew I didn't have a lot of rights to get out.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want any other child to have that burden. Like, I can't run to anybody. They're just going to send me back because my mom is nice. My mom's a good church member. You know, it's one thing if your mom's like some scraggly alcoholic, you know.
Yeah.
But if, you know, like she's an upstanding citizen and she's allowed to do this, where do you go?
That's true. That's true. And the question that because you made a really great point of like, you know, let's just let them believe what they believe. Okay, fine. Beliefs are one thing. Actions are another. And
practice is what we're talking about.
Yes. The beliefs are fine. You can have whatever bug nutty shit you want in your head. It's when that becomes something that not only do you do, which harms others who may not hold the beliefs that you have, but also harms the larger society because it shouldn't have to conform to what you want any more than it should conform to anybody. And
there's also the kind of this mentality in the courts that children are property.
Yeah.
And so, like, they can do whatever. It's kind of like in the Bible, you know, if you beat your slave, but it doesn't die in 3 days, then you're good, you know?
Yeah.
And there's this, I think we really need to get, again, with the citizenry, these children are citizens of this country.
Yes.
They have rights, you know, and being basically cooked to death in a fever from meningitis and people praying over you, so sending you to the hospital. You couldn't do that to someone as an adult. Why are you able to do this to children?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, if anything, it would behoove you to have more protections, and I totally agree with you. I think that's really the value of trying to educate people, and like we've talked about tonight, the value of citizenship, which I think is so important. Well, this has been a great conversation.
Yeah,
thank you. Oh, I've had a blast. This has been one of the most thought-provoking, and I think in many ways challenging, but in a good way, conversations, because I think you've made me really think about some of my own ideas about things and how I'm going to be a citizen, and I thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, as always, you can subscribe to us on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. If there is a podcasting platform that you would like to have me on that I'm not on, please let me know and I will try to make it happen. You can email us at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. We also have a Facebook page. We've just hit over 100 followers on our Facebook page. Woohoo! Which you are one of them. Thank you. Facebook.com/reasonrevolution, all lowercase, all together. Go give us a follow and like. That's where you can keep up with all the episodes and additional content. Also check out the blog, reasonrevolution.wordpress.com. You can also keep up with all the content there as well. And my own personal social media accounts. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and YouTube at The Daily Clark. Until next week, this is Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.